Hail cheaters and welcome to the Always Cheating Podcast. My name is Josh and I'm here with special guest Elevenify, aka Steve. Steve, welcome. Thanks for coming on the pod.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here. And Brandon is off doing, I'm not sure what, maybe he's climbing the Statue of Liberty today or something like that. I'm not actually sure what his plans are. So it's just me and you today, Steve. Thanks for coming on. I've been reading your tweets and following your Substack for a couple of, when did you start that Substack? Was it like 2 years ago, something like that?
I started it last season, the summer of last season, and I started it specifically for getting that piece out on thinking about hits. Okay.
All right. Which I want to talk about in a second. But before we dive into that, because that was kind of my introduction to you, and I really enjoyed it. And you and I spent basically, 360 days talking about having you come on the pod sometime. So I'm very, very glad to have you here. But just to kick things off, what is Elevenify? What's the origin of that name as well? And why did you decide to create it?
Yeah, sure. So OGs will remember me originally as FPL Meta. That was the name I went by originally. And then Mark Zuckerberg kind of conducted a hostile takeover on the association of that word. Yeah. So I kind of had to rebrand at that point. And I just sort of, I think one day Elevenify just came into my head as a kind of play on obviously the number 11 in the context of football. Yep. And that's sort of where the rebrand came from. And then I did also have a website, elevenify.com previously and things like that. But really it's just a rebranded name. Okay.
And you have, I know that you finished something like 1800th last year. And I think at one point you were doing, were you inside the top 1,000 late in the season? I feel like I remember following you and you having a pretty extraordinary season last year.
I didn't think we were going to get into my bottling of last season quite so quickly.
Sorry. Yeah.
But yeah, so I've been playing for 4 seasons. In terms of rank history, it's 2.6k, 25k, 28k, and then last season was 1.8k. Mm-hmm. And both that 2.6k season and this 1.8k season, I was in the top 100k around game week 30. And then my experience of game week 31 to 38 was a slow slide down to 4 digits, which is obviously still very good and I'm very happy with. But the three digit finish still eludes me.
Yeah, you said top 1K, right? I think you may have said 100K there, but you were in the top 1K.
Sorry, I was like 500, 600, something like that.
I have a similar story. My best finish ever is 12:24. I'll never forget it. Burned into my brain. And I was up to 500 as well. And I blew it in game week 38. So that is a painful. I maybe I'll get over it eventually. It hasn't happened yet. That was 4 years ago. And I went against I was debating between, I feel like I've rehashed the story like 20 times in the podcast, but I was debating between Aguero and Sadio Mane for my captaincy for game week 38. And it was basically a coin flip, as I recall. And I went Aguero, which I thought was kind of the safer pick. And Mane went off, scored a brace. I think Aguero just got me up an assist or something like that. So, again, we'll get there again, right, Steve? We'll crack that top 1K, maybe as soon as the season. Always possible.
I am slightly more pessimistic about that, but we can hope. We can dream.
Yeah, we can hope. I think there's a little too much pessimism sometimes about the top 10K. I actually think it's very crackable. I do not think that it's quite as it takes luck. There's no doubt about that. But I do not think that. I feel like there's an attitude sometimes that, well, if I even finish in the top 50K, and certainly that's an excellent finish, absolutely excellent finish. But I do think that if things sort of break the right way, it is very possible to crack the top 10K, even with kind of the rise of people just being much smarter about FPL than they were a few seasons ago.
Yeah, I think to crack the top 10K, I think we've got enough evidence now that you need to both play very well and also get very lucky. And the playing very well part is always within our control. So we can always just do the best we can there. And that's where the optimism lies.
Yeah. And then just embrace the luck part of it, right? Just hope that the luck, I mean, luck is, this is, I don't know, maybe it's because I have this background in poker, but I'm perfectly okay with luck being a significant factor. This is just something that I'm comfortable with this, right? The randomness of it. I think that's sort of part of the fun of it. And maybe I've just been lucky. I don't know, but I do think, I think that it's, I am going into this season fully, I wouldn't say like expecting exactly, but fully planning on at least cracking the top 50K. That feels like a very reasonable goal to go into for this season. And I feel like if I didn't feel that way, I would just be, I wouldn't be properly motivated. I think that I think you've got to shoot like fairly high to sort of spend the time doing the research and sort of getting this, I don't know, like sort of putting your best foot forward in terms of your FPL approach and strategy.
Yeah, and it looks like we're going to have the most normal quotation marks season for a while. So hopefully it's an even playing field.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for coming on. And one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on is I think you offer a slightly different perspective from Brandon and I. And Brandon and I, I think we probably overdo it sometimes in terms of the eye test stuff. I mean, I think both of us are pretty comfortable looking at Optadata. I'm an FPL review obsessive. I think it's fantastic. I know you're a fan as well. But one thing I think that you do is I think you combine a sort of a data-based or data-focused approach with narrative. And I thought the example of that was a post that you wrote last summer talking about taking hits in fantasy. And during the 2021-2022 season, you went through the entire season without taking a single hit. So in the Substack post, which anyone can go and find if they look for Elevenify on Substack or look for you on Twitter, they can find this post. Maybe you can like retweet it this week or something like that.
Yeah, sure.
But you talk a little bit about why all hits aren't the same, and I'm just curious how many hits, if you know offhand or you can recall roughly, like how much did your approach change last season? Like, did you take a number of hits? Was it kind of were the double game weeks throw that off a little bit? Like how has your approach changed at all?
So what I would say is that my approach to hits is as outlined in that article. I haven't really changed in terms of any philosophy or general attitude I have towards them. Yeah. The actual taking of them changed quite a lot last season, and any of these seasons where we've had kind of funky fixture stuff happening, because one of the key kind of core things I outline in the post, which we can go into some of the specific things I've mentioned, but I talk about this kind of framework for evaluating a hit, because generally speaking, it's very hard to know when a hit is worth taking or not. And even after the fact, when you've got all of the hindsight data, even at that point, it's difficult. So let alone, it's not easy beforehand either. So I outlined a couple of kind of heuristics or just kind of ways of thinking that can help you. But what I found is that those weren't really necessary when we had those seasons with funky fixture stuff going on, because it just became a lot more evident pre-moves that a certain hit was worth doing or not. Becomes a lot more black and white when you're suddenly dealing with a transfer involving more or less fixtures rather than just different fixtures. So that kind of killed a lot of those heuristics.
Yeah, I thought one of the takeaways that I took from it was the idea that, there's an idea in blackjack that you should either always or never hit on 16. That sort of, in some ways, it's sort of 50-50, and you should just kind of decide. You may disagree with this, but this is what I've always heard, which is that it's sort of, it doesn't really matter whether you hit or not. I mean, obviously, it sort of depends on what's showing, but let's just say that the dealer has a 8 or something like that. That you should either always or never hit on 16, and that's just sort of like a black and white black and white rule that you should follow. But I feel like, and I think some people think about hits the same way, which is that they're a manager who is very aggressive towards hits, or they're someone who is very reluctant to take hits. And I felt like in this article, you sort of outlined that it's almost the opposite of that approach. You shouldn't think of it like whether or not you hit on 16. You should think of it more like it's just incredibly situational dependent. And so kind of in any given week, you could maybe take a hit, right? And it just sort of depends on any number of factors. Is that a fair reading of that article?
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. And I think to add further context to my hitless season, I think something some people misunderstand sometimes is it wasn't an experiment or something I set out to do. It just happened to be that way, that over the 38 game weeks, things went so well for me, and perhaps maybe I played well enough that I didn't actually need to take any hits. But I could have just as easily taken 5 hits in that season. Generally speaking, I don't take many. My play style, if there is such a thing, my play style is very conservative. In the other 3 seasons, I think it was 1 hit, 4 hits and 3 hits. So even the COVID seasons were very, very few. But yeah, it's all about the situation. And that's kind of why I outlined that kind of checklist of things to think about. So, does it allow you to gain a captaincy? Does it help you with some injury or some minutes? Does it also add some team value? What about your chip strategy? Does it help you align with or bring you closer to that? Stuff like that. Those are the kind of things you should be running through when you're thinking about that. And at least you're never going to get it 100% right or with 100% confidence. But I think in the context of all of the uncertainty over the maths of whether it's worth it, I think if you follow those kind of principles, you're going to at least move closer towards more worthwhile hits than not.
And just, I want to touch on one thing we mentioned before, which is that you describe your managerial style as somewhat conservative. And I think that's interesting because sometimes I do wonder whether it is possible to get up to inside the top 1K playing a conservative approach. And clearly based on the evidence of your season last year that it is. I guess sometimes I wonder if you have to be a little bit unorthodox in order to, just because of the sort of similarities in terms of ownership styles, or in terms of ownership, like the sort of this idea of the template and sort of very popular picks. And so, I mean, do you think that there was something that you got especially right last season that helped you get into the top 1K, or do you think it was just, I mean, obviously again, luck is a factor. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging that, but do you think that there was something that you did last season that really clicked or really worked especially well?
Yeah. So I think when you were saying that, it reminded me of a podcast you guys did last summer. I think when you did it live from, was it the Blue Wire Studios? And
yes, in Vegas, yeah.
Yeah, and you were talking about picking your Game Week 1 team, and I think you were saying, oh, I hate that my Game Week 1 team looks so much like everyone else's, and then you kind of said that actually Game Week 2 is when the game really starts and you can, quotation marks, play your own game. And the reason that sort of come to mind is because I think a lot of people forget just how many accumulative different decisions there are in a season of FPL. You've got 38 game weeks plus chips, and then each game week you have 12, if you include captaincy, point scoring avenues. And over a season, that creates so many different kind of, I guess, trees. Trees is a good way, kind of in like programming trees, if you think about it like that, or different branches of outcomes that even if you are, or like even if you think you're staying very close to everyone else, over time, just small deviations will accumulate, leading to drastically different outcomes. So I think people, and it's not easy to do, we'll get into the psychology a bit, it's not easy to take stock of that every single game week when you're making these individual decisions. But I think if you can take stock of that and play in that kind of way and just trust in over a season, these kind of things will sort themselves out. These decisions will accumulate in the right kind of way. Avoid that temptation to do something wacky, do something crazy because you think you're really far behind or something like that. And I think that's probably what I did. The question specifically was, what do I think I did quite well last season? Is I think I did that. And actually, if I did have to analyse what went wrong near the end, I do think I didn't do that for the last 6, 7, 8 game weeks. I think I got a little bit too in my head. And when I saw that I was the rank that I was, if I had to pick something, I would say I got a little bit too up in my head. I made certain decisions that I wouldn't usually make. Specifically last season, for example, the main reason for my slide was I didn't own Salah for the entire end of the season when everyone else did. But that's fine. I don't regret my decision, and I think if I had the opportunity again, I would probably make the same decision. But just consistent decisions over the season, I think, is what people should focus on.
Yeah, I think it is tricky down the stretch not to really try to. It's interesting. I actually think at the beginning of the season, it's a little easier for me to avoid some of the template conversations, and I honestly try to go out of my way to avoid looking at other people's squads because I don't really mind having a squad that's similar to everybody else. I just don't want to know it. I don't want to see everyone else's. And as long as I feel like I've picked them myself and they're my own choices. But I find down the stretch, I'm much more aware. And to some degree, it does make sense because down the stretch, I'm maybe looking at the teams of the 3 or 4 managers who are that I'm competitive with in a mini league and thinking a little bit more about that. And I feel like I have a temptation sometimes to really kind of go for it. It's like I'm trying to, I don't know, it's like going for the green on 2 or whatever. It's like you want to just,
I think that's quite natural because I think at the beginning of the season, everybody is in your thoughts. And then towards the end of the season, it's those specific people that are in your thoughts, whether it be your mini league rivals or whether it be the band of, top 50k managers that you're competing with actively. That's kind of where your focus shifts and where I think EO-based decision-making can creep into your decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, good. All right. Well, this is a nice little taste of what we're going to talk about on today's pod. I want to talk a little bit more about data itself. So FPL and data. Then we're going to look at some squad and player thoughts ahead of the new season. So some real, like what I think might be some real practical discussions that'll be useful for people listening. And then finally, I put the call out to our Always Treating Patreon supporters and asked them if they had any questions for you. And many of them did. And so I've dropped a few questions from supporters in at the bottom of the pod as well. And so speaking of Patreon, I just want to quickly plug our Patreon. It's the first of the month, so it's a great time to become a new Patreon supporter. You can go to patreon.com/alwayscheating. We'll be doing bonus pods. We actually have a guest lined up for next week for a specific Patreon pod. I'm really excited to have this person on. And all week long, we do an extra pod for our Patreon supporters. You can also talk strategy and join lots of mini leagues. So if you're looking to join a couple extra mini leagues, you can do that in our Discord. And at the higher pledge levels, we have our Brandon's new commemorative glassware that Brandon just designed. He started to send those out to our patrons at the top 2 tiers. So once again, that's patreon.com/alwayscheating. We're also excited to partner with Fantasy Football Hub for our preseason content. You can go to fantasyfootballhub.co.uk/always for 50% off membership at any pledge tier. We have expert team reveals available as well. Many managers, or many of the managers that you know and love on social media, and they're kind of all over the place. Post on there, and you kind of sort of get an insight into their thinking, a little bit like we're doing on today's podcast. You can get your team rated by AI, and you get access to that wonderful Opta data, which is the thing I most enjoy looking at throughout the course of a season. So once again, fantasyfootballhub.co.uk/always is where you can go to get 50% off your Fantasy Football Hub membership this season. Let's take a break. We'll get back and we'll get right into our conversation with Elevenify/Steve.
There's no I in team, but there is one in Indeed, and that's the hiring platform that you need to build yours. When you're hiring, you need Indeed. Instead of spending hours on multiple job sites searching for candidates with the right skills, Indeed's a powerful hiring platform that can help you do it all. One of the things I love about Indeed is that it makes hiring all in one place so easy because Indeed does the hard work for you. They show you the candidates whose resumes on Indeed fit your description immediately after you post so you can hire faster. Join more than 3 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. Start hiring now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/Blue Wire Sports. Offer good for a limited time. Claim your $75 credit now at Indeed.com/Blue Wire Sports. That's Indeed.com/Blue Wire Sports, and support the show by saying that you heard it on this podcast. Indeed.com/Blue Wire Sports. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed.
All right, we're back. I'm here with Elevenify, aka Steve, and we're talking about FPL data, thoughts on the new season, and lots more. So, first thing I want to talk about, though, because it's somewhat controversial. Maybe controversial is too strong, but some people have very strong opinions about the use of data and modeling and FPL. And I don't know how much I don't see you in the trenches battling with people about this. So, maybe you don't have strong opinions, but what are your thoughts on the state of models and data in FPL right now?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's easy for me to not be in the trenches because, in my opinion, people overcomplicate what a model actually is. And I've always taken the view that a model is essentially just another way of expressing, a model in a technical sense, like we're talking about in FPL with your numbers and things like that, is basically just another expression of the sort of mental modeling that everyone playing FPL or making any decision actually is already doing and has. So, the models that we talk about in FPL that are really complicated with the predicted points, that's sort of the high-end, top-of-the-range model that we talk about. But actually, people post bookies odds all the time, and that's, they use that to incorporate models. That's just sort of a more simplified model than that, and then it just goes down and down and down to even our mental models.
That's a good point. I don't think people realize that. I think people still have an idea that bookies odds are some guy with a sheet of paper, right? Like in a back room somewhere. It's definitely not that.
Yeah, and I think another way that I express this sometimes is I use the example that actually anyone could make a model with numbers the same way that we talk about in FPL, and they could turn their mental model into it in a really crude way. You just need to grab a piece of paper, grab the FPL scoring rules, and then just write down the percentages of what you think the likelihood of those things happening is. So, a midfielder gets 5 points for a goal. I think this player has a 50% chance of scoring a goal. Okay, that's 2.5 points. It's a very crude model. It's just a very simple way of doing what these models are doing in essence. I think people really sort of overcomplicate them sometimes, or think about them as a kind of black magic voodoo kind of thing. But really, it's just sophisticated forms of percentages.
And for anyone who thinks that that this isn't being done by everybody, I think we could point to Fabio Borges, who's one of the most famous managers in fantasy. Maybe when I say famous, I'm sure there's people listening right now who have absolutely no idea who I'm talking about. But he's one of the most successful and highly respected managers in fantasy. Has done extraordinarily well for a long time. And I remember reading an interview with him a couple of years ago where he talked about how he works for, or at least he used to. He worked for a betting company in Spain, right? And and he that's, and knowing what we just discussed with betting companies, they're all about modeling. So I'm not sure he necessarily even used one of their models, right? But at the very least, he's familiar with modeling and with the importance of it. And so I guarantee that was the kind of inputs that he was using, right? Whether he had a crude model or just was comfortable with that kind of thinking.
I think it's known that Fabio was one of the earliest adopters of the Tokvam model. So I think we know this stuff. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. And the Tokva model is great. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I mean, I want to talk about what you do specifically, but just I think it's fine for us to shout out some people as well. I mean, Mikhail Tokvam, I've been a supporter of his for years. FPL Review, I whatever the premium membership is, I got that last season, and I mean, to me, I don't necessarily use them as a I don't necessarily do what they tell me to do. I just enjoy looking at them. I have a lot of fun just looking at what the models say. And the part of the fun for me each week is trying to just gauge my own thoughts vis-a-vis what the models say, right? And I don't know, do you feel the same way, or do you feel like you're really kind of beholden to what the models are, spitting out?
No, absolutely not. I think there's a couple of things on this. The first thing is that the person behind FPL Review will be the first person and is the first person to reiterate that it's a tool. It's an idea generation tool that is supposed to assist your decision making. It's not supposed to replace your decision making. And I think there is too often this idea that people just follow blindly what it tells you to do.
Yeah.
And sure, there are some people that do that. They won't be very successful, actually, because it is a tool and it has various inputs and various ways to use it to your benefit. And if you don't know that, then it's going to be to your detriment.
Yeah.
And it's also about using it with appropriate context and making sure it aligns with your actual beliefs.
Yeah.
So I think just generally the discourse on these tools still has some work to do. Yeah. I don't think we're there yet in terms of understanding what they are. I did a small thread on this recently, but I was just talking about tools, in specifically this case, FPL Review. And I was just explaining and reminding everyone that this idea of the optimal draft or the optimal way of doing things is a single output, and that there are hundreds or thousands of other outputs that are so close in optimality or being optimal to that first draft that it is essentially meaningless.
Yeah.
So it's easy to say this is the optimal draft, this person's popping up a lot, et cetera, but you shouldn't really forego your preference for the sake of the top result in a model or whoever's coming out in the most drafts.
Yeah, especially if it's not satisfying. I mean, I think what I enjoy about these models is the strategy of FPL is what I really enjoy, and I love it when I input my team and it spits out a few suggested transfers, for example, and there's frequently like a -4 or a -8 or something so wacky, right? That I hadn't even entered my thought, entered my thoughts to even consider a move like that, and I don't necessarily even make the move, but it's just the satisfaction of considering different strategic approaches is part of the fun for me. And so I really enjoy it when a model or whatever, even if I'm just talking strategy with somebody, it doesn't have to be a model, right? But we're talking specifically about models now. But when a new kind of line of thinking is introduced to me, that is part of the fun for me, whether that's a model or something else. And so it does seem like models are kind of the new way to introduce a new way, a new kind of perspective. And so that's what I enjoy about it, at least.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you see that littered throughout discussions on it generally when certain data sets or models are released, you see people's talking points change. That's not just models, it's the same with actual data and things like that. Again, we come back to the bookies odds. When bookies release their predictions for where teams will finish, how many goals they will score, that shifts people's perceptions as well. It's just another data point. And as you said, I encourage everyone to get as wide a range of sources as possible and consider all of them.
So, I think I want to talk about your thinking going into the season. I think we can kind of do that through the lens of squads and players. But just while we're talking about, models and sort of data inclined or data minded FPL accounts, are there, do you want to shout anybody out right now? I mean, I know inevitably we'll forget somebody that you and I both really like, but are there a couple people that you might recommend people follow if this is kind of their first introduction to looking at data? Are there a few, either websites or Twitter accounts or anything like that you might suggest?
Sure. So going from the very basics, from a footballing perspective, you have to call out FBref, which just simply is a great source of freely available Opta data presented to you in a very minimal style, in tables, with no agenda. It's just there for you to consume. I think the website isn't that intuitive, but spend some time playing around with it, learn how the menus and things work, and it's a really good resource. And then what I would also say, stayed on the footballing side in terms of what I consume, because I do have quite a light, these days I have quite a light FPL diet. I don't really consume too much FPL specific content. Sure.
Listen to the Irish Student podcast every week, of course.
Of course, that is why I'm here, fully endorsed. And I like anything produced by Tifo, particularly Tifo IRL, John McKenzie, and John McKenzie's got a particularly good Twitter account. He's very active and posts helpful stuff, and JJ Ball is also great. But
Brandon likes that a lot too.
Yeah, sure. And I think their key strength, their USP, is really presenting the complexities of football tactics in a digestible way. And the reason I kind of want to shout them out in the context of this pod that we're doing, particularly talking about data, is a lot of the time there can be quite an unhelpful narrative that there's this kind of data superiority and data rules all, and you don't really need too much else. And sometimes, some people might get a bit aggressive if people are leaning away from the data or like trying to use the data in what other people might view as an incorrect way. But my view is that if you're using data, you also need to be able to contextualize it and talk about it with footballing reasons. Because also remember, what we care about is we care about things being predictive. So I think we'll come on to some of this stuff more in depth when we look at some specific Patreon questions. But if the data says one thing and you want to know what will happen in the future, you've got to think about what is the predictive power of this data. And then also, if you think things will be different or your beliefs don't align and you're going against the data, that's fine. It's completely fine to go against the data, but you need to be pairing that with footballing reasons as to why you think the data doesn't tell the full picture. And I think TIFO is a really good introduction to start thinking in that way.
I think that's right. And I will even add a third point here, which is that I think you can make decisions for data sort of backed reasons. You can make them for football inclined reasons. And then you can even occasionally throw in a really dumb reason. And because, as you were saying before, the season is so long and there's so many different kind of ways to accrue points over the course of a full season, that sometimes I will, and I'll fully admit this, I will occasionally, if I'm debating between two players and I'm looking for a short-term buy, I will buy the player that plays on Monday because I enjoy having somebody in the final match of a game week. And I won't do it to be, if one player is way ahead, I won't do it. But if it's just sort of, if it's pretty close and there's an extra fun factor, I will do that. And as long as you're not doing that every single week and you're just sort of throwing that in as an occasional move, I think it's completely fine. It's not going to destroy your season. So I think there's kind of room for every type of thinking in this approach.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the key thing there is you're being very honest with yourself when you're doing that as well.
Right.
And that's key. That's key. I think it's the dishonest or naive use of data or reasoning that's really quite dangerous. Everyone's free to do whatever they want. Just be honest with yourself about why you're doing that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. All right, well, let's jump into some squad and player thoughts ahead of the new season, and let's start off with Arsenal and Liverpool. They have this sort of well, actually, no. Let me ask you one quick question because I think we're going to get into it over the course of this discussion, which is, can you give anybody who's not familiar a quick elevator pitch? All right, you and I just walked under an elevator. We're going up 20 floors. What is xMins and how important is it in your thinking throughout the season when you're making your FPL decisions?
Okay, I'm assuming this building has 90 floors,
yes,
90 minutes.
90 floors, and it's an old school elevator with it's not hydraulic, it's just the X up and down, so you got a lot of time to do it.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So let's not overcomplicate this. Very simple. When people talk about xMins, it's short for expected minutes, which means how many minutes do you expect that player to play in this match? Now, why would we care about this? And why is it becoming important? And why do many think it is the last remaining edge in FPL? That's a statement I've seen a lot over the past year or 2 years. So it's a prevailing thought that it's one of the last edges we've got.
Yeah.
So as a general comment, I think that the football discourse generally, and then also the fantasy discourse, has done quite well over the past few years in terms of their data usage and their data hygiene. So I think you can take virtually any of the main FPL content creator videos from any of the platforms, look at the videos they were producing 3-4 years ago and look at the videos they're producing this season, and you will see an entirely different approach to statistics, different statistics used, and most importantly, certain statistics not being used anymore. Now, we are slowly getting better with expected minutes, but we're not, that's sort of the next frontier of progress, I think, and we're sort of in the middle of that now. And I think just very simply, the key thing is that it's this basic understanding that whatever you think a player can or can't do, you need them on the pitch to do it.
Yeah.
So it's all about normalizing things to per 90, which is part of the data improvement we've seen. People aren't saying anymore, oh, this player scored 30 goals last season and this player only scored 3, and the first player played 38 90 minutes and the second player played 190 minutes.
Right.
And it's all about looking at the minutes played, because ultimately all of these underlying stats are only stats and relevant while that person is playing and is on the pitch. And in the context of fantasy, you only get points for things that are done.
Yeah.
And, if you want players that do those things, then you need them to be on the pitch for that. And the longer they're on the pitch, generally speaking, the idea is that they've got more chance of doing the very thing you pick them for.
Right. So let's bring Liverpool into this then, because I think that it's let's use a specific example then. They are in an interesting spot. They McAllister may have just limped off today, so that's its own. But let's put that aside for a moment and hope that he's okay, or will be very, very soon. So you have all of these a real midfield dilemma. I have a midfield and forward line dilemma. Really, you have Gabriel Jesus, Cody Gakpo, or not Gabriel. Excuse me. Let me restart this. I'm a little messy right now. You have Cody Gakpo. You have Darwin Nunez. You have Luis Diaz, Diogo Jota, et cetera, et cetera. You basically only have one person who is a true xMins king, right? In Mo Salah. And what are your thoughts on how we might resolve? I mean, can we even do it in preseason, or do we just need to avoid kind of all of these non-Salah midfield and forward players until we have a few weeks of evidence?
Yeah, so I think again this comes back down to if there is an edge left in fantasy.
Yeah,
this is certainly a good place to find it.
Yeah,
and I personally, I don't have a good answer to this question myself. I'm not sure. I will be avoiding a lot of these players that we are talking about, simply because I don't think I have the ability to get the knowledge or the confidence levels there that any of them will play the minutes I want them to be worth it. But if you are confident enough in a specific player playing the minutes, then there is an edge there.
Yeah.
But I think you also need to always take a step back and realize that this is a game about managing resources under constraints.
Yeah.
And this is the real issue just generally with minutes in the context of fantasy. And I think you see a lot of people on Twitter who sort of rub their hands together and revel in people saying, oh, you've got to avoid Nunez because the xMins are bad. And they think, oh, there's a massive edge to get there because he will play, or this idea that they don't actually need to play that many minutes to get the goals and things that they want. And I think people are free to take whatever view on that they want. I mean, from a game perspective, that's fine. Tools like FPL Review are really good because you can adjust the xMins and you can really see this effect that we're talking about of if they only play 40 minutes, then is it worth it? But I think the real key thing is just getting your own personal confidence levels there and reminding yourself that this costs resources. It costs you transfers. It has an opportunity cost. You have to forego other options. It can mess things up quite badly if you do get it wrong.
Yeah. This is the problem I ran into. I had one of my first drafts, I had Cody Gakpo in my squad, and I'm not sure my thought process was articulated as well as the way you just articulated it and sort of in my head, right? Because we sort of, it's kind of, in some ways, especially if you've been playing for a long time, the thinking that you just outlined is kind of baked into your thinking a little bit, right? But I think that's exactly why I won't have Gakpo going into the season, because it's just, I don't want to get that wrong. It's just a little too messy at the moment. So, I mean, in other words, well, okay, let me ask you specifically about Mo and Trent then too, while we're talking about Liverpool, because Mo Salah comes in at 12 million, just turned 30 years old. Trent comes in at 8 million, which is I don't know, he's arguably been a bargain even at his high price for many years, but they don't have a defensive midfielder right now. And he is certainly has not gotten any stronger as a sort of on the ball defender over the last couple of seasons. So what are your thoughts on Salah and Trent going into the season? Do you think you'll have Either, both, neither? Where are you with those two players specifically?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I think this is a very sad topic, because these these players are beloved by us, but I think by calling it sad, you can kind of see where I'm going with this.
Yep. Yes, I can.
And particularly with the Mo Salah part of it, I think there was a Patreon question. Shout out to the Patreon again. That was kind of Mo or no.
Yes.
And I think that's a question that is perhaps better phrased as, do you want Mo or do you want Haaland?
Yeah.
Because the key thing in my view is I don't think you can have both. I think you just sacrificed too much this year. So because of that, and I don't really have the appetite for going without Haaland, I'm currently no on Salah. I can't fit him in with Haaland. And Trent is so... I don't want to go on a rant about fantasy here, particularly about prices, because then this would be the longest pod you've ever done. But I've been quite public with my views about pricing, that they bungled it last year, and they've done it again this year. But specifically, what I don't get, and what is frustrating, is that they have bumped up Trent to 8 million. That is so out of sync with what they've done with the rest of the pricing. So Trent at 8 million would usually, or should in theory, be fine and be appetizing. But in the context of everything else just being so much cheaper.
2.5 million cheap. Someone like Ben Chilwell, right, is 2.5 million cheaper.
Yeah, Chilwell's 2.5 cheaper, and especially the 5 options we've got. We've got Estupinian, and then you've got loads of good 4.5s this season as well. Yep. You've got the Villa defence there. You've got Newcastle defence there. I also think there's going to be some starting 4.5s for Chelsea as well. And Arsenal one's a 5, Gabriel Zinchenko. It's just in the context of the meta we've got this year based on the pricing, Trent is really hard to justify, I think.
It's a good perspective. That makes sense to me.
I think I certainly, again, this is the context of what we're saying here. Again, I just want to sort of repeat what I said earlier about, we're talking about sort of different solutions or drafts that are quite close to each other. So, if your preference really is that you think Trent and Salah and Liverpool are going to really hit the ground running and be great for fantasy, then don't let that stop you. Yeah. I don't think they're that. I don't think Trent is that far away. I think Salah with Haaland probably is, but again, don't forgo your preference if you strongly have that. But for me, I currently have neither, and I'm not sure I see that changing.
I'm going back and forth. I may have finally talked myself out of Salah for exactly the reasons you just articulated. I do think that Virgil Van Dijk is an interesting question at 6 million. I guess my worry now is just whether, if McAllister is gone, Fabinho, people could argue that Fabinho was addition by subtraction, but still, it would be great if there was somebody who could play a defensive midfield spot for Liverpool. And at the moment, they haven't really solved that problem. So it makes me wonder, again, if you can get Arsenal defenders, central defenders for 5 million, you can get Man City central defenders for 5.5 million. Is 6 million for Van Dijk really worth it just because he's got a little bit more goal threat? Probably, it's a tough call.
Yeah, it's a tough call. And I think Liverpool, and again, a couple of other teams with them, are going to be really key teams for inserting your football interpretation of certain things.
Yep.
Personally, for me, I haven't quite seen a footballing explanation that satisfies me in terms of why exactly they capitulated to the extent they did last season, and then in turn an explanation as to why that has been resolved this season.
Yes.
If I had to give sort of an off the cuff thought about Liverpool, it's kind of, at the moment I'm kind of thinking they'll probably finish third or fourth best team in the league, and I think they'll probably get there scoring a load of goals and conceding a load of goals, but just scoring more. That's currently my thinking.
Yeah.
But again, if you have a different preference, then that should inform the kind of assets you pick. So again, if that's my thinking, makes Trent even less appealing to me.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, because if you see him almost purely as a midfielder, there are midfield options cheaper than. I mean, you can get someone like Matoma at 6.5 million, right? And so it's okay. Well, we could, again, I'm conscious of. I feel like we could spend 20 minutes on each of these teams, but let's talk about Arsenal a little bit. Gabriel Jesus, it just came out this afternoon that he is out for a few weeks. Any thoughts on how this might impact Arsenal? My feeling, and I think this is backed up in the actual FPL returns, but my feeling was that Nketiah up front was not as good for Gabriel Martinelli in particular. Does that jibe, or have you thought about that at all, or how Gabriel Jesus being out might affect the team as a whole?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because it wasn't even clear to me before Jesus got injured exactly how they were going to use all of their forwards that they've accumulated now, plus Havertz as well. Right. So I didn't even really have a view or an answer to that before he got injured, and I'm not sure if him getting injured makes it simpler or not. I'm quite famous for being a fan of Trossard for various reasons. I think it could be very good for him. Yeah. I think Arteta might like him in that kind of more central role
over Nketiah, perhaps.
Yeah, I really like Nketiah, but I don't really. I mean, they've got Nketiah and they've also got Balogun, but I don't really. It seems I'm not informed on Arsenal enough to know. So if anyone does have a strong opinion on this, please do reach out. But it just seems to me that Arsenal never really have had or do have any intention of using either of them.
Yeah, it's really hard to say. It feels it feels a little messy. My feeling is if you truly think that Arsenal is the second best team in the Premier League, then Saka at 8.5 million feels like a very fair price and maybe slightly underpriced. Any thoughts on Saka? Saka versus Odegaard debate is kind of interesting to me as well. I don't know. I guess I have to admit I am a little, even though Gabriel Martinelli was so good for my squad last season, I think that Gabriel Jesus news takes him out of the equation a little bit. I remember somebody once saying that it's, in some ways it was the sort of, the Jesus and Martinelli paired up really well, and Odegaard and Saka they kind of looked to each other. And I don't know if that was actually a data-backed piece of analysis or not, but do you have any thoughts on Saka versus Odegaard, or preferring one over the other?
So I feel very strongly about Saka. He is probably one of the players I have, probably second to Haaland, definitely going to be starting with him in my team. I've done zero thinking about it since the prices and everything were released. I think he's as close to essential as you can get, considering the role he has in that team, the numbers he has underneath that, penalties, the opening fixtures. And then also the minutes, as we've mentioned. If there is a dilemma about minutes in Arsenal, there isn't a dilemma about Saka's minutes as far as I can see.
No, not at all. No more than anybody else who's kind of a lock.
Yeah, and then in terms of the other midfielders, I just need to get myself there with Martinelli's minutes for me to consider whether I want him or not. I'm not that hot on Odegaard. I never really... I don't think I owned him at all last season. I think players like that, James Ward-Prowse also falls into that category.
Yeah.
Where I think I probably do have a blind spot to them.
Yeah.
I think that could be an area of improvement for me. I find it really hard to semantically and emotionally to get myself there.
Yeah. You can sort of squint your eyes and see a value priced KDB, but he just we need to ensure that he'll actually score enough, because it's the goals that he scores tend to be kind of right place, right time kind of things, right? It sort of falls to him outside the box, or, I mean, even the free kick stuff, even less, I think. It's really more about the kind of, so yeah, he might have been a tiny bit lucky. I actually don't know what his XG versus his actual goal scored last season is, but I wonder if he overperformed it a little bit. I don't want to put you in the spot here. I don't know if you know what it was offhand.
No. Well, I mean,
yeah.
you just have to cast your mind back to the goals that he scored last season, and there's obviously an overperformance of XG there.
Yeah.
And then I suppose you adjust that for whatever you believe his finishing skill is, and his likelihood to repeat those kind of screamer goals. But
I pulled it up while you were talking from FBref, which is he scored 15 goals on an XG of 10, so a 5-goal overperformance there. Okay, I want to move on to some of the questions that we got from our Patreon supporters in a second, but I just want to do a couple quick hits on some squads, some players. Some teams and some players that have given people a little bit of a headache, and one of them for sure is Chelsea. We expect they'll be better than they were last season, but how much better do you think they'll be? Are there players that you're targeting on these squads? I mean, it feels like Nicholas Jackson has really taken off in the last week or so as a kind of much discussed FPL asset. So, what are your thoughts on Chelsea generally?
Yeah, so I do think it's fair to say that Chelsea are definitely going to improve, but I currently don't know what is a reasonable expectation on that improvement or what it might look like. I think for me, firstly, in terms of specific players, Nkunku is phenomenal and was always going to be phenomenal. And it will probably be, on average, the best asset at any given time from Chelsea. Mm-hmm. And in terms of Nicholas Jackson, that's a good one to talk about in terms of exactly how or to what extent will Chelsea be better. And coming back to this whole idea of you've got to back it up with some footballing reasons.
Yep.
And for me, from what I've seen and what I know about him, I'm not sure how predictive this pre-season we've seen from him and Chelsea is going to be, but he definitely adds something new for them. Yeah. There's a specific ball that we've seen in quite a few games that they play for him to run onto, and it's just not something Chelsea had previously. Yeah. So that's like a real new footballing thing that could translate into relevance, but I'm not sure exactly what the minutes will look like. And I think then the defense is a big question mark for me. If I have a rough idea about how the attack's going to improve, it will look like how I just outlined. But the defence, I really have no clue what a reasonable expectation of their defence will be this season.
So I feel too. I mean, there's a part of me that wants to just take a flyer on Ben Chilwell and hope that it works out. we did our little defender ratings, and he sort of just missed the cut. I think he was like 11th in our defender ratings. And any thoughts on him? I mean, Reece James to me is just off the table. I can't handle the risk of recurrent injuries with him. But any thoughts on Chilwell or James for that matter?
Yeah, Chilwell is one I like. Again, coming back to the footballing side of things, again, what we've seen in pre-season is he is the one of the back four that is running up, and the other three sort of move into a back three, and he is just getting all the way up that left side. Yeah. And it seems, from what I can see, to be Pochettino giving him a license to do that, rather than just sort of Chilwell going off on a jolly on his own, like Andy Robertson does sometimes. Mm-hmm. That I think is so obviously not what Klopp wants him to do, but he does it anyway. Which obviously you worry about, because then it could just stop. But with Chilwell, I think it does seem to be that he's going to continue doing that. So I think I am leaning towards starting with Chilwell at the moment, and then potentially Nkunku. I'm not sure there's enough that can happen that will make me start with Jackson or anyone else.
Okay. Yeah, I think, I could see myself with Nkunku and Chilwell. I think you may have really convinced me on Trent. I was sort of starting to make a case for him, but I think you're right that just the kind of value over replacement player. It's a sort of the price is so much
exactly.
Higher. Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk just a couple more quick questions, which is we haven't talked very much at all about the promoted teams this year. It feels like an especially weak pool of promoted clubs in terms of what. Listen, I mean, we'll see what happens in terms of their actual match points. But from an FPL perspective, I've not seen a ton of value. Is there one squad or one club that kind of stands out to you that might be a little bit better this year?
Yeah, so I think Burnley are pretty hyped, because Company, particularly from a sort of romance narrative perspective, what Company's done there is really nice. He's come in, he's revamped everything, he's changed the style of the club. They dominated the Championship last season. There's a lot of hype there, a lot of just a lot of good football, feel good stuff. Yeah. But I think we need to proceed with caution, because I don't have the numbers in front of me, but they ran very hot last season in the Championship from an attack perspective. Yeah. So I think if there's going to be anywhere of value with them, it will be in defense, where it seems they were truly solid. But I think that it's worth paying attention to them in the first few game weeks to see what they look like, and to see tactically how they look, also how they set themselves up. Is there any accommodation happening, or are we kind of going to see almost a Leeds, if you remember Leeds' first season, where they didn't compromise and they started shipping a lot of goals?
Yeah, a lot of fun though.
A lot of fun.
Okay, let me ask you one more kind of big picture question, then I want to get into these supporter questions, which is about goalkeepers. And I'm just curious, who is your, okay, let me ask this broadly. What are you thinking about in terms of the goalkeeper position this season? And have you zeroed in on a keeper that you plan to have in your squad? Are you still debating between a couple of options? I feel like I'm still a little bit on the fence between a 5 million and a 4.5. Sort of basically Pickford versus Onana are the two that I'm considering. Where are you right now with keepers?
Yeah, so I think, although I was sort of ragging on the pricing earlier, I think the keeper position is actually the one position this year that is really nicely priced in terms of what you get at the different price points. I would probably say that I'm leaning towards 4.5s like Johnston and or Pickford at the moment. But there's great choices at every price point. And I think that probably there's going to be more switching between goalkeepers during the season than we've seen before.
Interesting. Yeah.
That's my first reaction to the selection we've got.
Yeah.
I don't think that there's any sort of best price point this season. A lot of the 5.5, the never buy 5.5, never buy 5 million stuff is kind of a bit misguided. In my view, they do offer quite good value above the lower priced ones if you select them at the right times and for the right reasons.
And Man City don't concede one goal from one shot on target in several matches, right?
But I guess that's also my general thing about goalkeepers, because I did have a little bit of a I did lean into sarcasm a little bit on Twitter last season to do with Edison, I will admit. With regards to, picking a goalkeeper is a hot topic recently, and people sort of seem to dismiss Edison because of this kind of, concede one goal, he doesn't get any save points, doesn't get any bonus points, etc., etc. But it doesn't, goalkeepers are the most difficult position to accurately predict points, just because of the way they're set up in the score system. That is true. Trying to model goalkeeper points and project it is kind of a little bit of as close to black magic as modeling can be. It is very, very difficult. Yeah. But that does not mean certain things are not more likely to happen than other things. So, just because Man City did receive some insane variance for that period last season, that doesn't mean that is a fair reflection on what Edison is as an asset here.
All right. Well, I'm glad to hear that we're basically on the same page, though. John Stone probably we probably need to give him a little more love on the pod. He was terrific the second half of last season. But let's move on to some questions from always cheating patrons. I think these are fun. I'm going to limit us to, let's say, 4. I'm going to give you 4 questions, lightning round style. Which is just a joke. Take as long as you want to answer any of these. But Sir Matt Ma says, can you name a player who may have a breakout season? He says, I keep finding myself strangely drawn to Darwin and would really appreciate being talked out of it. So any breakout candidates emerging for you right now?
Right. So I think I would say from an FPL perspective, I quite like the Darwin Núñez call there. Mm-hmm. I think I'm happy to kind of agree there. Again, it's about the minutes. Yeah. And it seems, based on what I've heard, that Klopp has kind of almost explicitly told us what the route to those minutes will be, which is basically his defensive contribution. Okay. I think Klopp has basically said Darwin will get in the team if he ups his defensive contribution to the level that I think probably Gakpo does. I'm not convinced we're going to get there, but if he does get the minutes, then it would be a breakout season. I think he is just chaos incarnate. I love it. And he will just FPL points will magnet to him.
I want to like Darwin. I worry still that he's a little too in his own head. It just feels like even today, I know he had a big miss in the match. And it just, there's an element of, but I remember when Firmino first joined. Firmino's also a player who was known for his defensive contributions. And that first, I can't remember if he joined at mid-season or if he'd played a full season. I'm not a Liverpool supporter, so I can't remember this exactly, but it felt like it took him a little while to sort of settle in at Liverpool as well. And then once he did, he became this kind of all-purpose dynamo, right? Who could score and was unselfish. Yeah. Defense. So, I'm a little on the fence about Darwin. Anyone else come to mind right now? Anyone else that you're kind of excited about?
So I'll give another one, but from a footballing perspective. Okay. It won't necessarily transfer into FPL, but it could do. But I'm buying a lot of Kevin Schade stocks from Brentford. Yeah. I really think it's going to be a breakout season for him. If he gets the minutes, then I think we're going to see double-digit goal contributions from him. He's 5.5 in FPL, so if he does get the minutes, he will automatically be an FPL option. But it's very hard to know exactly how many minutes he's going to get. But I rate him a lot, so I'm happy to go on record that I think this is going to be the season where he really introduces himself to everyone.
Great, and that is probably playing a left wing with and Bomo on the right, I guess is how that would work out. Probably, most likely, this up front.
Yes. So Shard is incredibly flexible, and I think for Brentford we'll see him on the left and slightly more centrally. Okay. But even when he was in Germany, I believe he got most of his minutes on the right. He can do anything and everything up front, and that is also the issue for all of the Brentford front players. I think they've got one of the most flexible front lines in the Premier League, which is a bit of a headache in terms of working out where those minutes are going to go. And Bomo will get more minutes than anyone else by far. That's not a headache. It's just who's going to fill in the centre forward and the left wing position.
I'm concerned about Vissa because he's only 6 million. He's very appealing as a forward option, but I just worry about whether he's a consistent enough starter in that squad. I have to still giving that a little bit of thought. We'll see. You know, some of it comes down to what I do with Trent as well. You know, am I going to have an extra 1.5 million or so to throw around somewhere? So anyway, all right. Well, let's move on to a couple more questions here. Michael asks, are any Man City players other than Haaland worth the risk? It's a good question.
Yes. So general comment first is that I think Pep Roulette, or whatever you want to call it, is much less intense than it has been in previous seasons.
Okay.
The past season and a half, the lineups have been relatively consistent and relatively easy to predict compared to recently. Compared to previous seasons, sorry. So firstly, I think that's a little bit overblown, and I think you're going to see a season where it's much easier to pick those Man City midfielders than previously. Pep will always still Pep, but in terms of worth the risk, I think Grealish is probably the next best bet. I think he's going to get a lot of minutes. He's going to continue to be a threat. Yeah. And on balance of everything from the midfield, I like Grealish the most. Obviously, we all know what Foden can do and what Foden can do in less minutes than Grealish. Yeah. But I'm not quite sure if it's worth that over Grealish when you compare the minutes difference at the moment. Yeah. And then defence is always going to be fine if you can get it right. But they've just agreed a deal for Guardiola as well, haven't they?
That. So 90 million or something like that, some insane amount.
Probably good value, actually.
That's true.
I think he's very good, and I think he will play a lot.
Center backs and defensive midfielders, right? You can't really overpay for them. What about Alvarez? Any thoughts to him? I mean, I know he's a risky one as well. I think he could get some starts, but I'm a little cautious there. He's very cheap though.
Yeah, so I hate to use the term, but Alvarez is probably one of the closest things we've got to a game breaker. Mm-hmm. If he does reliably get those minutes, which I think will be quite easy to predict if things like KDB injury niggles continue to be a theme. Sure. Yeah. That kind of thing will make it a lot easier to predict. I think in absence of that kind of stuff, I don't think it's going to be the season where you can pick him without targeting it at the moment. Yep. I think we're going to see increased minutes from last season. He's going to be better than last season, but again, it's constrained. It's a game under constraints. We've only got so many transfers and stuff. There will be a time. There will be a game week. There'll be a double game week where it might make sense, but I think not to start with unless you've got particular insight that he will get the minutes you need.
I do think the Community Shield on Sunday may give us a sense of what Pep might, or I don't know. I think it has been a fairly, because they played in basically every Community Shield over the last several seasons. It tends to be a pretty reliable indicator of the kind of lineup he's going to be rolling out early in the season. So we'll see what he does there.
Yeah, and I think with someone like him, you don't need too many minutes. I mean, I in addition to Trossard's, I'm also quite famous for being a lover of Ferran Torres, and I started the season with Ferran Torres 2 seasons ago and held on to him until game week 3 when he got that 18-point haul against Arsenal. But that was a really kind of similar situation where I was very, very confident that he would continue to start the season and even continue to start game week 3 based on the state of their squad and who they had available. Yeah. But I was only expecting about 60 minutes from him. But in my view, that was enough. Yeah. And it's very similar here with Alvarez. So you don't get too up in your head about it. If you think you're going to get a good hour out of him, then at that price, worth a consideration.
Yeah, at that price being the crucial part of that, right? All right, well, Shiv Roy, I hope that's the actual. I don't know what do I mean by the actual? It's not a real person named Shiv Roy, but let's hope it's the actress who played Shiv Roy who asks, how many Premier League newcomers is too many Premier League newcomers to start the season with? There are a lot that appeal to me: Onana, Diaby, and Cuckoo, to name a few. So, from your perspective, our kind of European, I think these guys all come from various European clubs. Do European stats, are they a reliable predictor of what you're going to get from an FPL perspective from the kind of these new players? So would you risk having 3 brand new in the Premier League players in your FPL squad?
So without dodging the question, I personally don't really like this idea of being a Premier League newcomer, or that kind of thing, just generally conceptually. For example, I listened to the Athletics Brentford All Access podcast I did recently, and there was a good bit in there where they spoke about the Brentford recruitment team places almost no emphasis on the idea of Premier League experience. The question is, are they good enough, and do they fit the role? And that's kind of more where I think you need to lean the analysis towards. So, for example, let's talk about Nkunku this season and Jackson and Diaby. I think they're good enough. The fact that they're new to the Premier League, even if you want to apply a healthy tax on their numbers, I still think they're good enough and they're still options. And I don't think having any amount of people that are good enough is too many. But you just sort of also need to be kind of confident that they're going to be able to translate those numbers in an appropriate way.
Yep. So,
to take another example, I was quite high on Scamacca when he moved to West Ham.
Yes.
I really thought that was a good transfer for West Ham, and I can't believe they secured it over other teams. I thought Scamacca, and I do think Scamacca has lots of potential. And then he went to West Ham and he just didn't seem to be used by Moyes in any way that was conducive to his skill set and where his good numbers were. Yeah. And I don't really think that's anything to do with the Premier League. I think it was to do with that specific situation that he went into.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think in West Ham maybe are kind of notorious for that too, right? Who's the
Haller was the other one
who was terrific for Dortmund last season. So, okay, yeah, I think that's a good perspective, and I think in Nkunku in particular, I mean, he's just been he's about as reliable. I mean, he might as well be a Premier League transfer in terms of what kind of track record we have on him, right? I mean, I think he's probably one of the least risky new signings we've had. I mean, it's so clear how he can fit into a Premier League squad.
Yep, I fully agree.
All right, well, let's wrap things up then with a defender question. Love to talk defenders. We did our defender pod on Sunday, and it was one of the trickiest pods we've done in preseason because it's just such a gigantic pool, to choose from. It's really hard to narrow it down. And as you may have heard, the Premier League has decided to do a World Cup style of extra time now. So we may get something like 10, 11 minutes of injury time now at the end of matches. So FPL guy says, given the decision to add extensive injury time minutes at the end of games, does that change the way you think about defenders heading into the new season? So is that affect your thinking at all? I don't know, one way or the other about what kind of defenders you may want?
Marginally.
Yeah.
So I think the impact of this is currently being overblown a little bit. So yes, we will see less clean sheets, but it will be very marginal.
Okay.
So I think if you draw out your clean sheet percentage likelihood per game, I think when you average it all out, you're looking at 1-2%, 3% less of a clean sheet.
Yeah.
Sort of per game. It's really marginal. And also, I mean, to put it another way, this is my view. To put it another way, you can also think about how it will impact attackers, because then obviously that informs how many goals you expect to be conceded. Let's take Haaland, who I think we can agree is the one who scores more goals than anyone else.
Yeah.
And let's take a really generous approximation that Haaland roughly scores 0.8 goals per game, which I think is fair, even including penalties. That sounds about right. Mm-hmm. Roughly, if you do some back of the envelope maths, my view is that's sort of between 1 to 2 goals more per season that he's going to get purely due to these extra minutes that are added on. Like if you roughly think it's going to be an extra actual 5 minutes of played time every single game, right, that's only a goal or two.
Right.
So I think people are overblowing it a little bit. Obviously, then if it is genuinely 15 minutes of actual play every game we see extra, then you can times that by 3. But I don't think it's going to be like that, and it's quite marginal.
I'll add on the margins that I'm sort of delighted by this. I think I honestly feel like, I'm basically just fine with VAR now. I had some issues with it being sort of poorly implemented at the start, but I think once they introduced the Dutch style thick lines, it basically fixed all of my issues with it. But I do feel like the minutes spent doing VAR reviews has never really been fully accounted for in terms of injury time, and so I hope that this helps with that a little bit. So, all right, well, we got through that one quickly. Let me ask one more defensive question then, which is from Harbor Boy. He says, what is the actual relative importance of clean sheets, attacking returns, and bonus when it comes to picking defenders? So we hear a lot of narrative about it, but some aspects of defense provide greater points advantages, or do some aspects of defense provide greater points advantages than others? So I guess when you're sort of modeling or thinking about defenders, are there certain things that you weigh most heavily? Like, is it a defender with some attacking potential? Is it just value? So what are you sort of weighing when it comes to picking defenders?
Yeah, so this is a great question. Basically, my view is that clean sheets will always be the bread and butter, followed by goals or assists, depending on which way you pass that up. Mm-hmm. So, clean sheets are always the event that is most likely to happen for defenders, and you get 4 points for that. And you get more points for goals, but they are significantly less likely to happen than a clean sheet. Yeah. And then you obviously only get 3 for assist, which kind of put it up there. So, I mean, again, let's do some quick back of the envelope maths. Like Trent last year, he got 10 clean sheets. That's 40 points. He got 2 goals. That's 12 points. And then he got 11 assists. That's 33. So, goals and assists are below the clean sheet amount. And I think those are fairly normal numbers, or even low on the clean sheet side. It's always going to be your bread and butter is clean sheet. So always be careful of getting too focused on a defender that is a great threat.
That's a great way to frame it. I love that. I have never actually thought of it quite that way before. So well, this is a perfect place to end this podcast, because I love the way you think, and I love the way that you framed it for people listening to the pod, and for me personally too. So Steve, thank you so much for coming on the pod. I had a great time talking with you. I found it very insightful and really interesting. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope to be back again.
Absolutely. And maybe we'll maybe when Brandon gets down from climbing the Statue of Liberty or whatever it was he was doing today, we'll get him on the next one. Just want to quickly once again say go to patreon.com/alwayscheating if you want to support the podcast and get extra podcasts each week at all. And I want to quickly shout out our Always Cheating producers as well. Thank you to Mike DePietro, Trevor Ingerson, our buddy Chris Howell, Babas Kuhn, James Holland, Dave Wagner-Lodell, Nick Wright, Lazarus Yenas, Jesse Halstead, Bruce Kerr, Brian Chin, Blair Jacobson, Todd Byerly, Andy Portlock, at FPL Merch, Gary Swanson, Jefferson Turner, Buffalo Wild Mings, Francis Moore, Sam Shower, Caleb Robbie, Belger Paulson Kruger, Alex Holcomb, James Keatley, The Saint, Bob Fox, Craig Jackson, Shalon F. Kadakia, Terrence O'Donnell, Paul Herzig, Heath Cram, Thomas Tisloff, Noah Louise, Travis Grant, Julio Pena, Linus Wennerstrom, and Dan Parsons. You can find the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Stitcher, Acast, et cetera, et cetera. You can also follow us on Twitter at Hail Cheaters, Instagram at Hail Cheaters, Facebook at facebook.com/alwayscheating, I think. You can email us, and you can find the Always Cheating Super League by going to alwayscheating.com, our website, clicking that button right at the top. So thank you once again, Steve, so much for coming on the pod, and let's have you back soon.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.